My name is Martin Fleischmann. I'm part of Geography Data Science Lab at the University of Liverpool. I'm going to present a small part of the project called Urban Grammar we work on together with Danny Aribas Bell as part of the Alan Turing Institute of Great Britain. The title is Classifying Urban Form at a National Scale, focusing on the case of the Great Britain. And I can start with a statement that scaling morphological studies can be a daunting task. We all are aware of traditional schools of urban morphology, either the work of Konzen, Kanejima, Maffei, and others, and they almost cannot scale. The historical geographical work Jeremy Whitehand was mentioning during his keynote earlier today relies heavily on the knowledge of the development of individual places, knowledge which is hard to get at scale. Similarly, the work of Caniggia and Maffei or Saverio Muratori in Italian architectural typomorphological school of urban morphology very often starts from the detailed understanding of individual buildings, the architectural detail, which, as we can all imagine, cannot be obtained at scale, let's say, for the whole country. And even if we would be able to get such information, it would produce a huge amount of data we would be able to process very easily. There is a very well-known school of space syntax, which can scale, but at scale it offers limited insights. I don't want to criticize space syntax in the presentation, but when it scales up, it naturally works only with street networks, ignoring building patterns, ignoring plot patterns and other aspects of urban form. Recent years are showing the growing amount of morphometric approaches to the study of urban form. And they are trying to find a way how to scale up. And here I'm closely linking this presentation to the work of Giovanni Fusco, was presenting as the first presenter in this session, or second, sorry, or the work of Meta Berghauser-Pont and the whole Chalmers School of Urban Morphology, who are developing the typology of 5 cities across Europe, or the work of Warren Yochem and his team at the World Pop at Southampton on the gridded approaches to classification of urban form, or I'm building on my own work presented at last year's ISUF, trying to develop a foundation for the taxonomic approach to urban morphometrics. And all these methods are resulting in several opportunities which we didn't have before. We are able to develop a classification of urban form which is detailed, which means that it doesn't work on the level of nations, cities, metropolitan areas, but it can work on the level of individual buildings if we want to. The work which is consistent across the whole nation, for example, if we would work with a historical geographical approach and we would require different historical maps, we would most likely find different periods for different cities, which would slightly result in certain inconsistency across the whole dataset. And because the morphometric approaches are quantitative and can be written as scripts in Python, in R, or other languages, it has potential to be scalable to national levels or beyond. And one of the works which is trying to be at the same time detailed, consistent, and scalable is our research trying to identify a spatial unit which we call spatial signature. And spatial signature is a characterization of space based on form and function designed to understand urban environments. But it's not by default a characterization of built environment only. So spatial signatures are covering entirety of space. In the case of Great Britain, we have identified 20 different signatures, from very natural signatures like those covering the whole highlands up in Scotland to very dense neighborhood centers in large metropolitan areas. But spatial signatures, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, are based on form and function. But since we are on ISUF, I would like to talk about form. I would like to talk about one of the two components of spatial signatures. This component is often studied using qualitative work, quantitative case studies, using morphometrics, which is what we will use, or even using remote sensing, very, very often, especially with the growth of openly available or closely available high-resolution satellite data. What we use are Ordnance Survey open data, because one of the imperatives of our work is that everything we do should be open, unless there is a good reason not to do so, which rarely happens. And in case of Great Britain, the essentially only consistent open data resource for building footprints is Ordnance Survey OpenMap, but it can be a little bit limited. Which means that this is Ordnance Survey for a part of Glasgow on the left-hand side, and this on the right-hand side is OpenStreetMap, which in this specific area is nicely detailed. But you can see, hopefully, in the resolution on your side, that on the left-hand side we have single polygons, very often denoting the whole blocks, but on the right-hand side we see individual buildings. The imperative we work with is that we are trying to develop a method which is robust enough to provide valuable insight into urban form based on the information on the left, the one which is open, but the one which is at the same time less detailed. And we are enriching building footprint input with street network, and that combination proves to be relatively robust. And again, I'm gonna follow up on what Giovanni was mentioning, and that's the question of the spatial unit. In our case, as we need to cover the entirety of space, we have to go slightly beyond what is normally used in urban morphology. We cannot work with buildings because in the highlands there are no buildings. So we have developed a unit we call enclosed tessellation, which can be created based on the set of delimiters, set of boundaries, which normally are street networks, rivers, coastline, railways, and those together create the boundaries which enclose areas we call enclosures. So we have enclosure areas on top of which we overlay building footprints which work as an anchors within the space and which are used to develop enclosed tessellation. So it's a Voronoi tessellation around building polygons within each enclosure. I know it may be slightly complicated, but the resulting structure in very dense urban environment is very similar to what we know from plot structures, and in very rural environments it's essentially covering areas enclosed by 4 roads. And the next question is, how can we describe it, and how can we describe it numerically? That's where urban morphometrics come to stage. Urban morphometrics in general can be seen as a quantitative analysis of urban form, and in practice it's all about measuring different aspects of urban form. We have identified that there are 6 different distinct groups of measurements we can capture, ranging from dimensions as building area, through shape indices, how similar the building footprint is to a square, for example, to spatial distribution, how far away are different buildings from each other, through intensity, which covers most of the densities we all know, through connectivity, which covers the aspects of street network, and to the diversity, how different the urban form elements are at the certain places. And we try to capture all six of these groups. So the whole procedure starts from enclosed tessellation. On each of the enclosed tessellation cells, which we have 14.5 million of them in Great Britain, we embed all the measurements from cells themselves, and importantly from their context, because every piece of information we work with is considered within its spatial context. And we use this input as a data input for cluster analysis, which in our case we use simple k-means analysis because it proved to work quite well. And going to results, we have identified, using only the form component of spatial signatures, 19 classes, which we can roughly divide into three main groups. Into classes which cover predominantly the countryside, in the low-density suburban development, in the outer areas of cities, and in the dense city centers. So going through a couple of examples, this is the area of Liverpool and Manchester. And if you go through those three classes, we can see that this would be classified as a countryside. This would be classified as a suburban lower density development. And you can see that it comes quite close to city centers in this specific case. And these would be city centers in Liverpool, Manchester, and surrounding towns. Going to Birmingham, which we have seen before in Jeremy Whitehand's presentation as well. And again, going through the different classes, we can see that Birmingham and West Bromwich and Walsall and Wolverhampton are essentially single city. And if we go to the level of city centers, we can see that there are those sub-centers within the large metropolitan areas still visible even in the form. And finally, I cannot miss London, the place which is predominantly covered by very dense development. So the proportion of city center classes, which are these ones, within London is much higher than what we would see in Manchester and Liverpool or even in Glasgow. And I would like to stop at the city center class because there is a really interesting story in the spatial structure of these dense centers. And that's the concentric character of the British centers and their hierarchy. So starting from London, we can see that there are 5 different classes of urban form. And with the exception of those two dark red in the central part, they are really concentric. So we can see that the density of the place and the urbanity of the place, the level of urbanity, is kind of growing as a pyramid towards the center of the city. And what is really interesting is that the dark red or purple color in here is present only in London, while the red one is also present in Birmingham, but that's almost the only other place where it is presented. And the smaller cities we look into, like Edinburgh, their centers are formed by urban tissues or urban types, where the outer level, let's say in Birmingham, or the third level in London. And we can follow through Southampton and Oxford to the level of small towns which have relatively compact town center, which is the least dense development of the central area of London in its spatial character. And one anecdotal place at the end is Milton Keynes. For those of you who don't know, Milton Keynes is a new town built since 50s up until now. They are still developing some parts of it, and this place does not have a morphological center. So everything we can see in Milton Keynes, even though it seems to have some kind of areas which can be seen as central, in the context of the whole Great Britain, everything in Milton Keynes is seen as suburban low density development. So a few points to take away. Urban morphology can be scaled. We just have to switch to different mode of thinking, different mode of work, and we have to rely on quantitative analysis for urban form. It can be morphometrics, but it can also be remote sensing and other approaches. The form component of spatial signatures of our classification of built environment can derive classification of urban form in detail, at scale, and in a consistent manner. And the better measurement of urban form we have, the better understanding we can we can derive from that, and better influence we can have on the policy in the later stages of research and applicability for research. And that's all from me. Thank you.